We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin and Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 7b. On the previous summit, the Gemara had a contradiction within Rava. On the one hand, the Rava said that if there's a shinoi bailim, in which a person, let's say, slaughters a carbon chatos for somebody who's obligated to bring a carbon ola, a different carbon, so then the carbon chatos is still kosher. It's not considered a shinoi bailim because the ola is not the same as the chatos. It has to be that you had in mind for a different person who is chayav a carbon chatos. Then we would say that the carbon is puzzle. But again, if you had in mind for somebody who's chayav a carbon ola, then we actually say that the carbon is kosher. But on the other hand, Rava said that let's say you have in mind for somebody who's not chayav anything, so there we actually say that the carbon is psula because every single person has at least violated some asay, and a carbon chatas really is a kapara for asay, for a violation of an asay as well, from a kal v'chomer. If a carbon chatas is able to be a kapara for krisos, it can certainly be a kapara for a violation of an asay, and so that's a contradiction, because here you're saying the violation of an asay is included within a carbon chatas, but on the other hand you say that if you shecht the carbon chatas for somebody who's chayav an ola, which is a violation of an asay, so in that case we say it's a different carbon, it's not considered the same as the carbon chatas, and that's why the carbon chatas is kosher in that situation. And so the Gemara now continues and answers, mikiva lo mechapra, in its essence, the chatas is not really a kapara for an asay, but mikufya mechapra, but it does give some incidental kapara, and therefore in a situation where the person actually already separated an ola, so there we would say that the carbon chatas is still going to be kosher if you have in mind for the person who separated the ola. But if you just have in mind for a person who in general has violated mitzvah asay, so in that situation, again, we would say that the mitzvah asay are shaykh to the chatas, and therefore the chatas would be psula. Rashi explains, mikiva lo mechapra, in its essence, it's not a kapara, meaning chatas asay. A carbon chatas doesn't essentially give an atonement for an asay, but mikufya mechapra, but incidentally it does. Hilkach, therefore, al misha mechuyev ola ksheira. Let's say you slaughter the chatas for somebody who's chayav an ola, it's kosher. Kevan dehifrish ola, since he separated an ola, shaychi kulu asay shabiyado ola, all of the asays really go on the ola. Vesulo shaych chatas gabe, and the chatas is not relevant at all anymore to this person's asays, to this person's ola, and that's why the chatas is going to be kosher. Aval mishlo hifrish klum, but let's say you had somebody who never separated any carbon, v'averos asay biyado, and he has with him violations of asay. So there, shayach chatas gabe, to that person, the chatas is relevant to him. Dilo have him ischayev chatas mechaper asay mikufya, because had he been liable to a chatas, that chatas would have been mechaper incidentally on the asay. Hilkach, therefore, chayil shmei chatas, so therefore his name, so to speak, is chal, it takes effect on the chatas shenishchata lishmo, which was slaughtered for him leposla, and therefore it actually is possible, it is disqualified. And the Gemara continues, V'yama Rav, and Rava says, Ola shashachta shalo lishma, if you have an ola that was slaughtered shalo lishma, aser lizrok dama shalo lishma, you're not allowed to do this rikas dam shalo lishma, meaning to say, just because you did the beginning of the process shalo lishma, the avoda of the shchita shalo lishma, that doesn't mean that you can go ahead and continue to do the other avodas like zrika shalo lishma, and this was a statement we actually had earlier. Iba yisei makra, iba yisei masvar. If you want, I could say that we learned that from a pasuk, or if you want, I could say we can learn it from logic. If you want, I could say we can learn it from a pasuk Motzos Masechet Ishmor. We learn it from the pasuk of Motzos Masechet Ishmor. Again, the Gemara previously went through how that drasha works. And Iba Yasei Masvar, if you want, we could say it's logical. Mishum Dashani Bavachulu Kideresh Pirka. Just because he deviated at one stage of bringing the carbon doesn't mean he should deviate at the later stage, again, as we said in the beginning of our parak. And the Gemara continues, V'yama Rav, and Rava says, Ola habola achar misa, if you have a carbon ola that comes after the death of the owner, shachta b'shinoi kodesh, so if the yoresh, if the heir slaughters it b'shinoi kodesh, he has in mind a different carbon, so then psula, then it's disqualified. But b'shinoi bailam, but if he has in mind a different owner, ksheira, then it's kosher. And why is it kosher? De'ein bailam lachar misa, because there are no bailam after the original owner died. And Rashi explains, la'achar misa, after death, shemeis ba'aleh, again, the case is that the original owner died, v'hikriva hayoresh, and the heir now brings the carbon, and so we say in the situation of shinoi kodesh psula, it means it's disqualified. Lo also means to say it doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner. V'tzarech hayoresh l'havi acheres, and then the yoresh would have to bring another one, but again, b'shinoi bailam is kosher, that would satisfy the obligation of the owner. And the Gemara continues, Rav Pinchas Breder Rav Ami Amar, and Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Ami, says, Yesh bailam lachar misa, there is considered to be ownership after death. And Rashi explains, Yesh Bailam Shahayoresh Hu Baaleh, that the Yoresh is considered to be the owner. And so the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Pinchas Breider Rav Ami. Rav Ashi said to Rav Pinchas Breider Rav Ami, what exactly do you mean? Davka Kamar Mar, are you saying specifically that Yesh Bailam Lachar Misa, meaning are you really saying Yesh Bailam Lachar Misa, and are you actually arguing on Rava? Are you saying that in a situation of Shinoi Bailam, it actually is going to be disqualified? Uboy leisuye ola achrisi, and then the person would actually have to bring another ola because it's disqualified. It's not going to count for the owner's obligation. O dilmor, maybe diika kama asay gabe mechaper. Maybe it simply means that if the person, the yoresh, has some violations of asays, so it's going to be a kapara, but it doesn't really mean that yesh bailam lachar misa, and therefore we're going to say that it's disqualified and you need to bring another carbon. Amarle said to him, dafka kamina. No, I really mean that there are bailam, and therefore if there would be a shinoi bailam, it actually would be disqualified in the sense that another carbon needs to be brought. Rashi explains, Dafka Kamar Mar, does the master actually mean there are bailim? Ipligi ad Rava, are you arguing on Rava? Uboyle suya achrisi, and therefore another carbon would have to be brought in a situation of shinoi bailim. O Dilmer, maybe what it just means to say when you say yesh bailim lachar misa, it means diika kama asay gabe de yoresh, that if there are some violations of asay by the yoresh, mechapra, so then it's going to be a kapara, im lo shina ba, if there would have been no shinoi, meaning in a situation, if you would not have deviated, not have had a shinoi bailam, so then it would be a kapara. Umiu, but nevertheless, hecha deshani, let's say the person does have in mind the shinoi bailam, a different owner, lo boile suya achrisi, you won't have to bring another one, da'iu lo nadar midi, because the yoresh never made the original neder, that was the original owner, and therefore you would not need to bring another carbon. That was the question, and he said back, yes, the yoresh does in fact need to bring another carbon. And the Gemara continues, V'yamar Rava, and Rava says, Ola, carbon ola doronhi, it actually is a gift. Rashi explains, Ola doronhi, the ola is a gift. Eina ba l'chaper al asay kapara mamish. It's not actually a carbon that is an atonement for the violation of the asay. Even though we say that a carbon ola comes to atone for an asay, it's not that the carbon is the atonement. Ela achar shekapara hatshuva al asay. After the tshuva, the person does tshuva and repents, and that creates the kapara, the atonement for the asay. He bolak polas ponim. So then you give it almost as a greeting, as a gift to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the atonement. Ka'adam shesarach b'melech v'ritzei al yedei praklitin ucheshabola hakbil panav mevi dorm biyad. It would be like a situation where a person sins against the king, and then he's able to appease the king, and the king gives him forgiveness, and then he goes and greets the king, and he gives a gift. That's the idea that the ola, the carbon ola, is a gift. It's a gift after the repentance is accepted. And the Gemara continues and explains, Heichi dami, because what exactly is the case? Ideleka teshuva, if the person is bringing the ola and he didn't do teshuva, so zevach rashaim toeva, then we say that the carbon of a wicked person is an abomination. That cannot be the situation where a carbon ola is mechaper on a violation of an asay. V'diika teshuva, and if the person did teshuva, hatanya, we learned in a brayso, over al mitzvahs asay, if a person transgresses a mitzvahs asay, v'shav, and he does teshuva, lo zaz misham at shamochlim lo, he doesn't move from there until they forgive him. And so you see the forgiveness comes without the carbon. So what's the purpose of the carbon? Ella, rather, shmamino doron, who rather you see that it really is considered to be a gift. And the Gemara continues, Tanya Nami Hachu, we have a brayso like this as well. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Chatas lama ba, why does a person bring a chatas? Lama ba, what do you mean, why does he bring a chatas? L'chaper, it says, a kapar, it's an atonement. Ela lama ba lifnei ola, rather, the question is, why is it that anytime you bring a chatas and an ola, the chatas comes first, and then the ola? And the answer to that is, it's similar lepraklit shenichnas, it's similar to, let's say, a person sends in someone to speak on his behalf. He enters, reads a praklit, so then after the praklit enters and he appeases the king and the king gives forgiveness, so then nichnas doron achraf, so then the gift comes after. That's the ola. The ola is like a gift. So you see this same idea from this brayso. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Chutz min ha-pesach v'achatos, with the exception of carbon pesach and carbon chatos, those are completely disqualified when they are done shalol lishmo. And the Gemara says, Pesach min nolan, from where do we know that the carbon pesach is totally disqualified if it's not lishma? Because it's written in the pasuk, Shamor es chodesh ha'aviv, it says you have to keep the month of the spring, v'yasisa pesach, and make the carbon pesach, and it means shehu kol asiyosav l'shem pesach, that everything that you do with the carbon pesach, it has to be for the sake of the carbon pesach. And so therefore, you can't have any shinoi kodesh, you can't have in mind for another carbon. The Gemara says, Eshkechon shinoi kodesh, so we find this idea of shinoi kodesh. Shinoi bailim and all, and where do we know shinoi bailim? That if you have in mind a different owner, that it's going to be totally disqualified. Because it's written, V'amartem Zevach Pesachu, it says that this is a Zevach Pesach, and that means Shetahei Zevicha L'Shem Pesach, that the Zevicha has to be for Karban Pesach. That seems to be another Shinoi Kodesh pasuk, but we understand as follows, Emeino Inyan L'Shinoi Kodesh, we don't need to apply it to Shinoi Kodesh because we just learned that above, so Taneu Inyan L'Shinoi Bailam, so apply this pasuk for Shinoi Bailam. And the Gemara says, Eshkechon LaMitzvah, so we find at least that it's a mitzvah that there shouldn't be Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailam. La'akev Minol, and how do we know it's Ma'akev, meaning how do we know it's totally disqualified if you have Shinoi Kodesh or if you have Shinoi Bailam? Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, V'zavachta Pesach L'Hashem Elokecha V'gomer, and from the pasuk of V'zavachta Pesach L'Hashem Elokecha, we understand that it is Ma'akev. And the idea is that by repeating the requirement of Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailam in this pasuk, the repetition teaches us that it is Ma'akev. And the Gemara continues, Maskifla Rav Safra asks on this, Hai V'zavachta, this last pasuk we brought V'zavachta, Lahachi Udas, is it really coming to teach us the idea that Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailam are Ma'akev? Hai mi boy leilachid Rav Nachman, it's really needed for what Rav Nachman taught. D'Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Minayin lemoser Pesach, from where do we know, let's say you have extra animals, they were designated as Karban Pesach, but you didn't actually use them for Karban Pesach, so how do you know, Shekarev Shlamim, that those animals are brought as Karban Shlamim? Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, V'zavachta Pesach L'Hashem Elokecha Tzonu Bakar, it says that you're going to slaughter the Pesach Tzonu Bakar. V'aloin Pesach Bo Elam in Akvasim Uminoizim. Now, how can this be talking about Karban Pesach? The Karban Pesach is specifically brought from lambs and goats. It's not brought from Tzon and Bakar. Mikan L'Moser HaPesach, from here we know that the extra animals of the Karban Pesach, Sheyehei L'Dover Haba Min HaTzonu Min HaBakar, that it's for a Karban that is brought from Tzon and Bakar, from sheep and cattle. Umay Niu, and what does that refer to? Shlamim, that refers to Shlamim. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But in any case, that's really what we use the pasuk of V'zavachta Pesach L'Hashem Elokecha. And so the Gemara continues and says, Elamar Rav Safra, rather if Safra says, V'zavachta Pesach Lichad Rav Nachman. That's correct. The pasuk of V'zavachta Pesach, that's to teach what Rav Nachman taught, that if you have extra animals from Karban Pesach, you bring them as Shlamim. And Shamor es Chodesh HaAviv L'mitzvah B'Shinoi Kodesh, the pasuk of Shamor es Chodesh HaAviv, that tells you that Shinoi Kodesh is something that you should have l'mitzvah, meaning you shouldn't have Shinoi Kodesh. V'amartem Zevach Pesach b'Shinoi Bailam l'mitzvah, and V'amartem Zevach Pesach, that's talking about Shinoi Bailam, that it's a mitzvah not to have in mind a different owner. And who, and then when the pasuk says V'amartem Zevach Pesach who, it says it, so la'akev bein hacha v'hacha, that says that both by Shinoi Kodesh and by Shinoi Bailam, that it's ma'akev, it's an absolute requirement, and if you have Shinoi Kodesh, you have Shinoi Bailam, then it is going to be completely disqualified. And the Gemara continues, V'yashkechon zvicha, and according to this, we find this requirement by slaughtering of the Karban Pesach, Sha'ar avodos minol, and how do we know that it's true by other avodos of the Karban Pesach? And to that, the Gemara says, Hoel v'goli goli, once it's revealed by slaughtering, so we assume that it's true by all of the avodos of the Karban. Rav Ashi says, Hoel v'goli goli lo amrin, and we don't say that since it's revealed, it's revealed. Ela avodos minol, and rather, how do we know all of the avodos? D'chsib, because it's written in the pasuk, Zos haTorah la'ol mincha v'gomer. It says this is the Torah, these are the laws of the Ola Mincha. It puts all the karbonos together. V'tanya, we learned in a brayso, b'yom tzavosos b'nei Yisrael lahakrev es karbonehem ze bechor u'maiser u'pesach. When it says in that pasuk b'yom tzavoso, that includes bechor, it includes maiser behema, it includes the karban pesach. Hikishu akasav l'shlamim, all karbonos, they're all compared to shlamim. Ma shlamim bein shinoi kodesh bein shinoi bailim ba'inan l'mitzvah. Just like by the shlamim we find shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailim are needed as a mitzvah. When it comes to shlamim, it's not an absolute requirement in the sense that the carbon is not totally disqualified. It just doesn't fulfill the owner's obligation. That's la mitzvah. Avkol ben shinoi kodesh ben shinoi bailam la mitzvah. So to all of these karbanos, including Karban Pesach, this now is the actual source for Karban Pesach, that la mitzvah, there's an idea of shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailam. And then furthermore, ucha shlamim, and it's like shlamim. Ma shlamim ben zvicha ben shar avodos lo chilakta behen la mitzvah. Just like by shlamim, between slaughtering and the other avodos, we don't make a distinction. It's all a mitzvah. Af Pesach, so too by Karban Pesach, lo sach lo gbo ben zvicha l'shar avodos la'akev. We're not going to make a distinction between the zvicha and the shar avodos in order to be ma'akev. They will all be ma'akev. And according to this, we no longer need who, because the original psukim that we brought to teach Karban Pesach la mitzvah, shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailam, now those psukim can be used la'akev, because we're really learning mitzvah from shlamim, and so those psukim we brought originally can be used la'akev, and the word who is now extra. And so the Gemara now says, Elohu lamali, so the word hu by Karban Pesach, what do we need that for? And the Gemara says, Kidatanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Nemar bePesach hu, b'shchita la'akev, avol osham lo nemar bohu, ela la'achar haktoras emurin. When it comes to Karban Pesach, it says hu, by the slaughtering, there we say that it's ma'akev, we have shinoi kodesh, or shinoi bailim is ma'akev, but by the osham, that's why we need the hu, to tell us that Karban osham is different. Over there, the word hu is written after the burning of the emurin, the burning of the sacrificial portions, but when it comes to an asham, even if you don't burn the emurim, it's still kosher, and therefore that who is not teaching us this idea of ma'akev. And Rashi explains, Pesach Minolan, from where do we know that the Karban Pesach is totally disqualified? Again, if there's Shinoi Kodesh, Shinoi Bailim, Bein LaMitzvah, Bein La'akev. We're talking whether it's just the mitzvah that there shouldn't be Shinoi Kodesh and Shinoi Bailim, and even La'akev, that again, if there is a Shinoi Kodesh, if there is a Shinoi Bailim, it's totally disqualified. To Kosal Gadaita, because right now we think, Lo Asilon Kishar Zvachim Mishlomim, that it doesn't come from the other Karbanos from Shlomim, to Lo Ksibahu Krod Zos HaTorah, because Pesach is not written in that pasuk of Zos HaTorah. This Rabbi Kol where all the other karbanos are included lemitzvah, and again, then later on, the Gemara will bring the pasuk that follows and say that it in fact does include the Karban Pesach in that pasuk. Mosar HaPesach, then the Gemara said the extra Karban Pesachs, she'avad v'nischaper b'acher, let's say an animal got lost, he had a kapara with a different one, v'nimtza harishon, and then the first one is found, so now what do you do with that Karban Pesach? You can use that Karban Pesach, ledover haba min hatzonu min habakar, for a type of carbon that comes from tzon and bakar. Hainu shlomim, now that refers to shlomim, and the idea over here is as follows: shehein boyin mikol tzon umikol bakar. Shlomim can be brought from all kinds of sheep and all kinds of cattle. What that means is bein zechor and bein nekevos, whether they're male, whether they're female. Mashe'ein kein b'shar zvachim. That's not really true by other karbanos. Shehukvu o b'zachor o b'nekeva, because other karbanos have to either be male or female. Ola v'yasham, for example, Karban Ola and Karban Asham, hukva b'zacharim, it has to be male animals. And chatos, when it comes to a Karban chatos, hukva b'nekevos, it has to be a female animal. V'hukva b'zacharim, and also you have some situations where it's male animals by chatos, but only male animals could go in so'ir nasi. For example, the he-goat of the nasi, eino ba b'nekeva, that's not able to come b'nekeva. In any case, that's why we see when it says l'dover habam and atzonim and habakar, that's a reference to shlamim. That's why Moser Pesach is brought as shlamim. And Rashi continues, L'mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh, again the pasuk says, Shamores chodesh ha'aviv v'yasisa pesach, and that's a mitzvah by shinoi kodesh, meaning bekulu asiyos, and all of the doings, yalfinan minei, that's what we learn from there, that there can't be shinoi kodesh, ta'ksiv v'yasisa, because it says v'yasisa. And Rashi continues, who, it says in the pasuk, who, mashma pesach hu b'havayaso, means to say it has to be a pesach b'havayaso as is, meaning l'shmo kosher, if it's done l'shmo it's kosher, shalo l'shmo pasul, if it's shalo l'shmo then it's pasul, and dehacha v'hacha means here and here, meaning b'shinoi kodesh uv'shinoi bailim, by both shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailim, it's me'akev, dehu mashma tarvayu, because the hu is going on both of them, kishu asoi k'mitzvaso, mashma, it has to be done in accordance with the proper rules of the mitzvah. And Rashi continues, ve'ashkechan zvicha, and so therefore we find this by slaughtering, b'shinoi kodesh uv'shinoi bailim, by shinoi kodesh and by shinoi bailim. How do we know that? By the other avodos. And so then the Gemara instead said, actually, we learn out the mitzvah of shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailim from the other karbanos, from the pasuk of biyom savoso, samach lezos haTorah. It says biyom savoso, near the pasuk of zos haTorah, which essentially compares Karban Pesach to shlamim as well. V'darshinan smuchin, we darshan the fact that they're next to each other, biyom savoso lahakrav karbaneim, l'rabos karbana shalohos kruba mikra be'inyan shalamala. This includes karbanos that are not mentioned in the pasuk in terms of that topic that was discussed above. And then the Gemara said, af kol hilkach mitzvah bepesach yalfinan mishlamim. The point is, therefore, the fact that shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailim is a mitzvah by Karban Pesach, that's learned by shlamim. Deravina lo le'el shinoi kodesh l'shinoi bailim. And the idea is, therefore, the psukim we had earlier, they're going to be la'akev and uche shlamim. It's just like shlamim. Kilomar means to say, kevan de goli kroi kuva bezvicha. Once the Torah says it's ma'akev by slaughtering, yalfinan shar avodas li kuva, we say the other avodas also are ma'akev mehakesha, the mitzvah kishlamim, from the fact that it's compared to shlamim. Ma'ashlamim, just like shlamim, all avodas are the same. So too by Karban Pesach, all the avodos are the same. Elahu lamali l'chiritanya avalasham lo nemar. So if that's the case, what is the who for? V'lo garsinan kol mokom shenemar bezvicha eino ela la'akev. Rashi says, do not have the girsa, the line kol mokom shenemar Shneimar b'zvicha eno alakev, da'ach brisa lekamoni b'pirkin, that's a brisa later on. L'chidatanya, rather the who is for the following brisa. Kilomar means to say as follows. L'galuye al hu degabe osham, the who by Korban Pesach tells us that when it says who by osham, de lo yalfinan psulmine, that we don't learn a disqualification from that word who. K'demahader le, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer lekamon b'pirkin, it's like Rabbi Yoshua responded to Rabbi Eliezer later in our parak. Shayadoresh osham hu l'shmo kosher shalo l'shmo pasel, because he darshan from the who that the osham l'shmo is kosher, shalo l'shmo is pasel. V'kamahader le Rabbi Yoshua responded to him, Pesach nemar bo hu b'shrita, by Korban Pesach it says who by the shrita. Lefikach shalo l'shmo pasel, that's why it's totally disqualified if it's shalo l'shmo. Aval osham, but by the osham, where is the who written? It's written after haktaras emurin, and you don't even really need haktaras emurin, and therefore you do not learn an absolute requirement from the word who. You do not learn that it is ma'akev by the Korban osham. And the Gemara continues, chatos menolan, from where do we know Korban chatos, that if there's shinoi kodesh and shinoi bailim, that is ma'akev, it's totally possible. The chsiv, as it's written, v'shachat osal lechatos, it says you slaughtered as a chatos, shetei shchita l'shem chatos, the slaughtering has to be for a chatos. That's the idea of shinoi kodesh. Eshkechon shchita, so we find this by slaughtering. Kabbalah menolan, from where do we know the receiving of the blood? The chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Aleph.